All right. It is really my honor to be hosting this colloquium today and to introduce our honorable speaker today, Dr. Annette. Traditionally, sociolinguists in particular have been preoccupied by speech events and patterns of speech production associated with individuals or groups of speakers. The flip side of this realm of research has been generally understudied. So listeners' attitudes and perceptions of such speech events and particularly local patterns of speech have not received as much attention from researchers. When I think of this line of research investigating perceptual reactions to speech events, Dr. D'Onofrio's work is at the top of the list. Topics from sound symbolism or the iconic relationship between a string of sounds and what they could represent, to the interaction of persona and language behavior, to the social meanings associated with well-known local patterns in the US, such as the California vowel shift or the Northern cities shift, have been extensively explored by Dr. D'Onofrio. These are extremely important topics because, as I mentioned, we have been predominantly occupied with the production patterns and documenting patterns of language change in progress. Over the past few decades, however, we have seen a reversal of some of the well-documented local patterns such as the NCS. And while some have attributed such reversal of the NCS features to bigger socio-historical factors such as deindustrialization in the upper Midwest, we definitely need perceptual studies looking carefully at how listeners perceive such local patterns and the waning of features associated with them. Additionally, as sociolinguists explore the complicated relationship between linguistic behavior and multiple layers of speakers' identities, research on the social meanings of particular speech events and listeners' reactions to such linguistic features is much needed. Dr. D'Onofrio's invaluable dissertation work at Stanford University looked at the social meanings associated with trap backing, a prominent feature of the California vowel shift. In her dissertation and her subsequent works, Dr. D'Onofrio looked at not only the relationship between trap backing and speakers' persona, but also listeners' social expectations with regards to this phonetic feature. This is extremely important research as we continue to see the rise of features associated with the California vowel shift, also known as the elsewhere shift, as a translocal vowel pattern across North America, including both in Chicago and South Central and Southeastern Michigan. Dr. D'Onofrio has done extensive field work both in California as part of Stanford University's Voices of California project and in Chicago, where she is the principal investigator of the NSF-funded Chicagoland Language Project, exploring language variation in the city of Chicago and the surrounding areas. Dr. D'Onofrio has published numerous articles and chapters on her incredible research in some of the most prominent journals in our field, such as Language and Society, Journal of Sociolinguistics, Language Variation and Change, Journal of Phonetics, Language and Speech, and PADS, which is publication of American Dialect Society. Dr. D'Onofrio is currently an assistant professor at the Department of Linguistics at Northwestern University, and her most recent work explores listeners' perceptions of the undergoing reversal of features associated with the NCS in Chicago. A particularly innovative aspect of this important work is to look at age-related differences in listeners' perceptions towards this change in progress. So without further ado, I would like to invite our honorable speaker, Dr. D'Onofrio, to share with us her incredible research titled Perceiving Sound Change Reversal, Age-Based Dynamics in Chicago's Northern Cities Vowel Shift.
All right, thank you so much, Aman, for that super flattering introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? I can't see, okay, I can see Aman, so perfect. All right, I'm gonna share my screen and share the slides. And I don't think there's a way for me to answer questions as the talk is going on. If there are any, I don't know if there's a way for panelists to see if there are, but if there are clarification questions, I'm happy to take them throughout the talk or just save them till the Q&A. And I'm excited to dig in. Had some great conversations today. I wish I could be there in person, but hopefully someday, since we're not so far away, we can all meet. So yep, as Aman mentioned, I'm going to be talking about some work that we're doing in Chicago, particularly in relation to, oh, can people see the slides okay? Should have checked that too. Looks good.
Yes, we can see
Yes,
this.
okay, perfect, thank you. Related to, in particular to perception and production in a sound change, and in particular, a kind of reversal of a regionalized sound change. Okay, so starting with some context, as Iman mentioned, there is kind of a relative dearth of work on sociolinguistic perception historically, in favor of work on production, but this is becoming less and less of a kind of gap in the last few decades. So there's a growing body of work in this area. And a significant finding is that social expectations we have about a speaker can shape how we perceive or categorize phonetic productions. So this shows us that as listeners, we have knowledge about sociolinguistic variation in production, and we use that in terms of perceptual behavior. So I just want to get us all on the same page, show you an example of what this could look like using a simple word categorization task. So I'm going to show you two words on the screen, one on the left and one on the right, and play you a sound. And hopefully you can all think of, which word you think it most closely aligns with. So here's the first one.
Sack.
Okay. I can't ask you to, I think, raise your hands yet, but I'm guessing the vast majority of you thought that you heard the word on the left. I'll play it again one more time.
Sack.
Okay, I'll play you another clip. It's going to be a different recording, same two options.
Sock.
Okay, so again, hopefully you can hear that. And again, I'm guessing that the majority of you heard it as the word on the right. I'll play it again for you.
Sock.
Okay. Now I'm going to play you a third clip.
Sack.
Okay, so this one, hopefully you can hear, kind of falls between the two that you just heard. If I were to take a poll, if we could see, I'm guessing there'd be more of a split between left and right. So I'll play it for you one more time.
Sack.
Okay, so the insight that I mentioned that we've gotten from the work in sociolinguistic perception has shown that if I give you more information about who's speaking, it could shift how you hear this more sort of ambiguous phonetic production between two categories. In particular, if I were to tell you, for example, that the speaker is from Wisconsin and play you the same clip,
Sack.
you might be more likely to hear it as the word on the left than you were before. One more time.
Sack.
Or I'm sorry, the word on the right.
Sack.
So something like sacks and sandals, right? As opposed to if I told you that the speaker was from California, in which case you might be more likely to hear it as the word on the left.
Sack.
So putting something in a sack, right? And this is, of course, because in these two different places, the boundary that exists between these two features is in a different location phonetically, because of the vowel shifts that characterize many speakers in these locations. So in Wisconsin, where we find evidence of the northern cities vowel shift, which I'll be talking about a lot today, you can see that the COT vowel, C-O-T, is produced in a sort of frontal location, whereas in the California vowel shift, it's produced in a backer location, and this can lead to this sort of ambiguity that can be resolved through knowing something about the speaker. So as I mentioned, this work in sociolinguistic perception has shown us repeatedly that listener knowledge, not just about geographic background, but lots of other social factors, including gender, age, persona, can shift the linguistic perceptions that individuals have in this way. So in all of these cases, manipulating a speaker's perceived social characteristics can lead listeners to shift these perceptual expectations of speech, showing us that they know something about the social patterning of phonetic variation. A slightly smaller body of work, though still growing, is one that's looked not just at the kind of speaker expected social characteristics, but also the listener's social characteristics and how that can shape how they perceive language in the same way. And this kind of makes sense if we think about, differences in different listeners, since a listener's sort of social background or social positioning can influence the experience that they have with other people's language, the social associations they might make between linguistic features and speakers' social backgrounds or positions, it would make sense that these differences lead to differences in speech perception. And some studies have shown us that these differences in listener background do condition perception as well as production. So in particular, differences across different dialect regions, And again, this kind of checks out if you think about growing up and living in a different dialect region would determine the kind of exposure you get to certain types of productions of phonetic features. And that could ostensibly affect both production and perception. So in one of these studies, the Kendall and Friedland, they found that listeners from the southern United States were more likely to expect a speaker to produce vowels with a sort of southern vowel shift, more so than the listeners who are from the north or the west. And this also corresponded to a kind of individual listener level. So listeners who themselves produced more southern vowel shifted features, regardless of whether they were from the South or not, were more likely to expect the speaker to also produce those more southern vowel shifted vowels. But this direct mapping between production and perception isn't always kind of emergent in the studies that we see. So some show that listener-based patterns in perception aren't always neatly reflected in production or vice versa. So in an example, using a different paradigm, priming paradigm, Sumner and Samuel found that listeners from the same dialect region, New York City, show differences in production, but similarities in perception. That's kind of a rough summary of that paper. So someone from a given dialect region can be what they call a fluent listener, right? Even if you don't produce features from this certain dialect region, you can still kind of use them in perception. So like I mentioned, this kind of makes sense that folks from different places who exhibit different productions would also be expected to perceive language differently. There's also reason to believe that individuals, even within the same community, in the same very local place, could show different patterns in both production and perception, particularly when it comes to communities that are undergoing sound change in progress. So work on sound change, of course, has long shown us that listeners play a crucial role in the way that sound changes progress and start. So the potential for variation in how these sound changes are perceived or heard or represented or interpreted come to be a source for how the sound change happens and how it unfolds over time. Within a community, individuals, of course, are not all undergoing sound change simultaneously. They can be more or less advanced in that change at any given point in time. So we might therefore expect that this within community difference in production of the sound change might also affect within community differences in terms of perception. And this has been observed by researchers. So I have this nice quote from Harrington et al. In a study looking at British English. They say that phonological category boundaries are likely to be specific to different groups or speakers of the same speaking community, and above all, strongly related to the differences in their own speech production. So one huge factor within a community that we know structures both production and perception differences in sound change is age, or the generation that you're in within the community. So of course, in terms of production, we use speaker age really frequently as a sort of proxy for time in the sort of apparent time construct, right? So older speakers in a community represent the earlier, the more conservative iterations of a phonetic system. The younger speakers show us the kind of more advanced iterations. So given the connection between production and perception that I just mentioned, it's probably no surprise that we also see that listener age within a community can shape the sort of perceptual patterns that we see in terms of sound changes. So again, a number of studies have shown that when we see these age-based differences in terms of production, we also see them in the same direction in speech perception. So those that show more advanced productions of a change are also those that expect more advanced variance in perceptual behavior. But this isn't always the case. So a number of studies have also found that perception and production can be misaligned in terms of sound changes. So for example, Kettig and Winter, 2017, they're looking at the Canadian vowel shift in Montreal. They found that while there is this apparent time change in terms of production, younger speakers are advancing the Canadian vowel shift, but they didn't find any significant listener age differences in perceptual categorization of the same vowels. So they argue that within this single speech community, although individuals, play their part in terms of the production of the sound change, they're exposed to all speakers of all ages within the community who may be more or less advanced in using the Canadian vowel shift. So when they hear a new speaker, they don't necessarily assume that the speaker is going to be just like them. They're able to kind of shift in their perception in a way that reflects the fact that they're exposed to lots of different iterations of the change in their community. So in the US, in terms of US regional dialects, we have a lot of information about how sound changes in progress are unfolding, but relatively less about the perceptual side, and in particular, how production and perception are related when it comes to these sort of social differences in terms of speakers and listeners. So that's the broad question that I'm couching my talk in today. So what is the relationship between production and perception of a regional vowel shift at a local community level? So in particular, I'm focusing on the Northern Cities vowel shift, as I mentioned, in one very specific neighborhood area in Chicago, to try to get insight when we know a lot of context about one particular community, how the sound change is unfolding over time in production, what kinds of patterns do we see reflected in perception, and can we map those directly onto those patterns in production? Okay, so getting more into these regional dialect differences, as many of you I think know, differences in regional dialects in the US are often identified or related to vowel systems. So these are the kind of rough divisions that exist within North America in the Atlas of North American English. And many of these are determined based on vowel differences. One of the most well-studied of these regions is the one that I think all of us or most of us are in right now. This is in the dark blue, called the Inland North. So this encompasses the sort of Rust Belt cities, upstate New York, Detroit, Milwaukee, Chicago, and surrounding areas. The St. Louis corridor sneaks in there. And like many regions of the US, this dialect is primarily defined in the Atlas by its vowel system, the Northern Cities shift, as I've mentioned. So to give you the details on the Northern Cities shift, it involves the movement of these 5 vowel classes. So we can see dress, strut, thought, trap, and lot are all implicated, and it's this sort of clockwise rotation. It's been theorized to have begun with either trap raising and fronting or lot fronting, which has kind of seemed to kick off a chain effect. And I'm going to be using Wells classes just because who knows where my vowels are right now. So you know which vowel I'm talking about when I say the actual vowel class. Okay. So while this is a really well-studied vowel shift, it's relatively less studied in Chicago, and that's where I'm going to be focusing my work today. This happens to be the most populous and most diverse city in the Inland North, so there's a lot to kind of work with here, which is fun for us. Okay. To give some context, the Northern City shift has been studied in Chicago. It's been well documented over the last 50 plus years, including these studies here. But not only is the NCS sort of, prevalent in a dialectology sense, there are also very strong ideologies about these features that link it with Chicago in the popular imagination. And of course, this exists for other places like in Michigan and other locations. But when you talk about the Chicago accent, these Northern Cities vowel shift features will come up. So of course we see references to the Chicago accent that gets parodied in pop culture. And lots of these parodies bring up the sort of raised and fronted trap vowel, the fronted lot vowel. You'll hear the phrase mom and dad brought up a lot. So SNL's Superfans is a prime example of this. I know it's old now, but people still seem to be familiar with it, at least here. So this vowel shift has ties not just to the kind of region more broadly, but to Chicago more specifically in the popular imagination. And I want to importantly note that these features, when they're talked about as part of the Chicago accent, they're not supposed to be representative of every Chicagoan, no matter who they are, but of certain social types, certain types of Chicagoans or certain personae who have come to be linked with the accent. And importantly, these imaginings are almost always racialized as white. And this is going to come into play in terms of how I discuss what might be motivating the reversal of the Northern City shift in production. This has interesting implications for the sort of history of the Northern City shift and the spread. So like I mentioned, this connection between the Northern City shift and whiteness actually reflects a kind of broader tendency in the dialectology work historically, where many characterizations of regional dialects in the US are almost always describing the speech behavior of white speakers from these regions, whether we acknowledge this explicitly or not, often erasing the ways in which different racialized groups vary linguistically across the US and may or may not exhibit the same regional dialect patterns as white speakers. So the NCS is no exception to this in sort of dialect or quantitative dialectological findings, as well as in ideological commentary. We see that the NCS is linked with white speakers in particular. This is the case in terms of racialized patternings in some of the studies that have been done of the Northern Cities shift. So we find in some locations that white speakers contrast with African-American and Latinx speakers in studies done in this region. So often white speakers will show vowels that are more Northern Cities shifted than non-white speakers. And this is often attributed to residential segregation in these locations. So it's worth knowing, this is the case in Chicago as well. White Chicagoans in particular, moved away from the city center in response to the growing Black population throughout the 20th century. So you are probably all familiar with this term, white flight. Of course, we have it here, which has resulted in this residential segregation. But interestingly, in terms of how the Northern City shift has been theorized, there's more to the story than just this sort of reduced contact leading to these differences. So Van Herk has a super interesting proposal that the Northern Cities shift may have actually developed initially as a symbolic form of linguistic white flight. In response to rising African-American populations in these inland northern cities through the Great Migration. So the Great Migration was when millions of African-American Southerners migrated to these northern cities looking for employment. And Van Herk suggested that advancing the NCS at this historical time point heightened differences between these northern white speakers and the southern African-American people who migrated into the cities. So we can see reasons why ideologically the Northern Cities shift today might be linked with whiteness in particular. Okay, so zooming back out a little bit, patterns like the Northern Cities shift that differentiate these different regions have been well established. We're advancing over time well into sort of turn of the 21st century. And while these regional differences were getting kind of more distinct over time, we're actually now starting to see a trend moving in the opposite direction, much to many dialectologists' dismay. So we're actually seeing a lot of these sort of distinctive regional sound changes halting and even reversing in some regions. So, in particular, in terms of the Southern vowel shift, in terms of these kind of traditional vocalic systems in New York City, Philadelphia, Charleston, and in the Northern Cities shift, which is relevant for my research, we're seeing these sort of reversals or neutralizations taking hold. In the last sort of 5-10 years, there have been multiple kind of attestations of this sort of NCS reversal. So in particular in upstate New York and Syracuse and Ogdensburg, as well as Lansing, Michigan, we're seeing that there's evidence of this reversal happening recently. So given that these reversals have only sort of recently been documented, we still don't know exactly what's driving these reversals. There are lots of guesses about why, but a lot of the studies that I just mentioned cite very similar reasons, which kind of make sense for the socio-historical context of these locations. So first, of course, there's been increased mobility over the last few decades, as well as sort of migration patterns, media circulation. So the idea is that speakers in these regions seem to be coming into more and more contact with speakers from outside of their regions. And the idea is that this can lead to an increase in the awareness that folks have of their own features that are quote unquote local or specific to them, that might be linked with stigma. In many of these places as well, local speakers might desire sort of mobility or disaffiliation from their local areas. So in the Rust Belt in particular, and in some of these northern cities, there are, people are migrating out of these cities. So this increased extra local orientation might lead younger speakers who are kind of super locally oriented to want to disaffiliate. They might have negative evaluations of these local sounding features and not want to sound local. So in other words, reversal could be motivated by this combination of some kind of awareness of local sounding features with the motivation to not sound local. So the question is for us, when we're looking at a particular location that we think might be undergoing this reversal in Chicago, are these things actually changing in this community? Do we see this increase in awareness of local sounding features? Do we see an increase in extra local orientation or mobility? Or might there be something else driving this reversal that we can help explain the pattern? I also want to note in almost all of these cases, I think all of these cases, the focus has typically been on the production of these reversals. So a question remains, what's happening on the perception side? And how might perception of a sound change differ when we're talking about something that was advancing and now is reversing over time? Okay, so going back to this big question, I revised it a little bit, asking the relationship between production and perception of a reversing regional vowel shift. First, I'm going to dive in a kind of very broad level into a few studies we've done looking at how localized community changes unfold in production. As I mentioned, for the sake of time, I'm just going to give a kind of broad overview looking at what the changes are and some kind of rough explanations we have for why they're happening. But I have more details that I'm very happy to talk about later if you're curious. And then getting to the meat of the talk that I'm presenting today, how do these speaker age patterns that we see in production correspond to listener age patterns in perception? So do we have evidence that the apparent time differences we're observing on the production side show up in some way on the perception side, and how does that work? Okay. Let's see. So in the work I'm going to talk about, I have to acknowledge our kind of broader Chicagoland language project, which Iman mentioned. It's our ongoing project documenting sort of language and life throughout Chicago. I'm going to be presenting on the first field site. So the field work was done in 2017, 2018 predominantly. But we did receive NSF funding relatively recently. So we're doing this as a collaborative project with Dr. Sharice King at the University of Chicago. We're super excited that now we're starting up fieldwork again after our COVID pause. But also wanted to mention that this work, all of the work I'm going to be presenting was done in collaboration with many students at Northwestern, especially my PhD student, Jamie Benheim, who is a collaborator on, in particular, the production work I'm going to talk about. And like I said, stay tuned for more updates from us as we move into new field sites. We're super excited. Okay, so going back to our question, starting with this kind of broad overview of what's happening in production in terms of the community. And like I said, I'm just gonna kind of give you a little smattering of what we're seeing from the interview data. So all of these results are coming from sociolinguistic interview data within the same community, different subsets of participants within that community to give us some context for the production perception link study that I'll present in a second. So I mentioned that there is evidence of reversal of the northern cities shift in Chicagoland, and this has been true since before we started doing this research. So in particular, McCarthy found that while the NCS was continuing to advance for some features, it was actually stopping and even reversing for other features in 2011. Durian and Cameron similarly found that there's evidence of reversal that was class conditioned in their data. And so the studies that I'm citing here are the ones that I'm going to show you are apparent time results from. So in work I did with Jamie, as well as a work I have in prep with Jamie, another graduate student, Sean Foster, and Dr. Cherise King, we looked at differences not only among the white speakers in this community, but differences between white and Black speakers within the same neighborhood. So what are those neighborhoods? What is the community that I'm going to be talking about today? It's these, the circle, in the red circle, the far southwest side neighborhoods of Beverly and Morgan Park. So like I mentioned, all of this fieldwork was done in 2017, 2018. And just to give you some kind of context, socio-historical context for the neighborhood, Irish Catholics have been a super dominant ethno-religious group in this area since at least the mid 20th century. It's still very strong influence. People will identify by their parish, in particular, white people, Catholic people in these neighborhoods. They'll tell you, which parish they're from almost immediately. Many attend Catholic school. The Southside Irish Parade is a major annual neighborhood event, just happened on St. Patrick's Day, that is well known throughout the city of Chicago. So this is a kind of hub for this ideology of kind of Irish Catholicism in the city. But these neighborhoods are also home to many African-American residents. So African-American families started moving into the area in the late 20th century as racist housing practices were made illegal in the 60s. And interestingly, Beverly and Morgan Park residents, they were noticing patterns of white flight away from their area as this was happening. And they actually organized to prevent existing white residents from leaving. So they had kind of policies where they would not allow for sale signs to be posted on lawns. They would sue real estate agencies that were acting in predatory ways. And the result of this is a really kind of rare for Chicago, relatively integrated neighborhood area. So Beverly is actually the white majority neighborhood that has the highest population of Black residents, and Morgan Park is the reverse. So the majority Black neighborhood with the highest population of white residents in Chicago. And again, very, very rare for Chicago, which is extremely segregated. Okay. So throughout its history, Beverly and Morgan Park has been this sort of tight-knit, sort of long-standing, generations-long community. The majority of folks in Beverly are middle class to upper middle class, mostly single-family homes. Many people own their homes. So that gives kind of some class context. And the area is racially diverse, like I mentioned. This is mostly a Black and white kind of population. The other racialized groups are sort of less represented here. Many residents of all races are will talk about in interviews how proud they are of the diversity in this neighborhood. They moved there because of the diversity, et cetera, et cetera. But it's important to note that especially Black interviewees will talk about, the fact that there are still racist incidents, racial divisions that come up. This persists into the present day. There are things like, schooling differences in terms of race. I can't get too much into this just for the sake of time. I'm happy to talk about it for hours if you're interested. But just worth knowing that while we see this sort of integration, obviously there are still kind of tensions that exist. Okay. So like I said, I'll be giving you a kind of broad overview of the apparent time changes we're seeing in this community based on data, spontaneous speech data from interviews. So first, I'm going to present a study that Jamie, Benheim, and I did, just looking at white speakers. We started with the white speakers because of this ideological connection between the Northern Cities shift and whiteness, both in this area and in kind of dialectological work. There's a lot of data here, but what I basically want to draw your attention to is first the trap vowel in pink. So here the generations have been roughly grouped into 4 generations. And I'm showing you the directionality of the apparent time change. So this is F1, F2 space. You can see that the oldest generations, the circle and the triangle, are much higher and fronter than the younger generations in the square and the cross. So we saw a very significant apparent time change away from this raised and fronted trap vowel. So this is in the opposite direction of what we'd expect for the Northern Cities shift. You can see the Northern City shift in the lower right, if you're curious. So we see evidence of reversal for this feature in particular. We also saw strong evidence for reversal of the lot vowel as well. So over apparent time, we're seeing a lot of backing and raising of the lot vowel. These two vowels in particular are also the ones that we saw evidence for in other locations in the inland north. These are also the features, like I mentioned, that are very salient to people within these communities as being related to the Chicago accent. So we had a few other vocalic findings, but these are the ones I'm going to focus on for today. So I just want to play you what that sounds like in this community. So the reversal of the northern cities shift in terms of trap. So we have an older speaker here who is saying the word C-A-T.
Cat.
So you can hear that. And then a younger speaker saying the same word.
Cat.
Okay, so I'll play those back to back again. This is the kind of more conservative, older form.
Cat.
Cat. And then the lowered and backed kind of younger form.
Cat.
Okay, cat. Same, so these are again the same words, S-T-O-P, the older, more kind of northern city shifted version, and then the younger, more reversed version.
Stop. 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 Stop.
Okay, stop and then stop. So like I mentioned, the other vowels were less consistent in whether they were advancing or reversing in other places. And we also see that here. So the trap and lot effects are very strong in this community. And again, these are the features that are really salient to people in talking about the Chicago accent, right? In another study that I mentioned, we looked at just within a sample of people who identified as women, we were looking at racialized differences, whether those existed. So are we only seeing this sort of reversal amongst the white speakers? And the answer was no. So we're seeing apparent time northern cities shift reversal across both white and black speakers in this community. You can see the white speakers in blue, the black speakers in orange. And again, for those key features, trap and lot, we see kind of to the exact same degree, we're seeing apparent time northern cities shift reversal. So here the arrows are representing apparent time change. And again, the effects are extremely similar here. Okay, so like I mentioned, there have been some proposed ideas of why this reversal would happen in terms of an increase perhaps in contact, which would lead to an increase in awareness of the existence of these features over time. And perhaps this increased supralocal orientation among speakers in this community. So the first question we asked ourselves when we see this very strong reversal happening is, do we see younger speakers orienting away from Chicago such that they might not want to sound sort of Chicagoan or local and therefore would be reversing these features? But at least in our speaker sample, that's actually not what we found at all. So we found that many of our younger speakers, the ones that we were talking to, the ones that are very NCS reversed, they actually talk about wanting to stay in Chicago. So one of the speakers talks about, you know, she wants to stay very close to home. Another feels really connected to Chicago. One is going to go away for school and then come back because they really want to be kind of connected to Chicago. So it's not the case that we see this supralocal orientation. Another question is, do we see increased awareness or commentary about these features among younger people as opposed to older people? And maybe that increased awareness leads to more stigma. Again, that actually wasn't the case for us either. So while some speakers do mention these trap and lot vowels explicitly, it wasn't according to age. So it wasn't the case that younger speakers seem to mention this more than older speakers. Everyone, people of different ages seem to be aware of the stereotype related to the Chicago accent, and people of different ages brought up trap and lot explicitly using these kind of terms, the nasal A, the flat A. I never know if they're talking about a or ah when they say A, but who knows, maybe both. And then the mom and dad piece, right? Also worth noting was there wasn't sort of a change in the responses to who is most likely to use the Chicago accent. So there were kind of similar stereotypes relating the accent to certain types of people, both among older speakers and younger speakers. So we see a lot of mention of tradesmen, working class people, firefighters, police officers, etc. And digging in a little bit more to the specific locations and social types that came up in these metalinguistic discussions, we found, like I mentioned, that these NCS features were linked in this community to, in particular, white working class locations and personae. So notably in the metalinguistic commentary, both white and Black speakers talk about this sort of stereotypical de Beers accent being linked with Caucasians, being linked with certain types of occupations, certain types of kind of class positionalities, as well as neighborhoods that are historically sort of white working class within the city. So as I mentioned earlier, Van Herk has argued we might interpret the NCS as linguistic white flight, with advancement of the shift being linked sort of ideologically with white speakers' oppositional response to the Great Migration, trying to differentiate themselves from African Americans who had moved to the northern cities. So if the NCS might sort of indexically relate to this ideological white flight, we argue it could be the case that movement away from the NCS or reversal among these younger speakers reflects shifts away from this sort of ideology or association with that persona. This makes sense within Beverly and Morgan Park, given the history that I mentioned of the neighborhood. So the reversal of the northern cities shift that we see in this neighborhood among white speakers in particular, chronologically parallels this integration of the community. So given the link between the NCS and these sort of white flight linked personae and areas and ideologies, we think that this reversal isn't about sort of younger speakers trying to not sound local, but instead a sort of rewriting of what it means to be local, what it means to be Chicagoan or from these neighborhoods that reflects these historical changes, both in demographics and in ideologies that took hold over time. Okay. So just to kind of give us this broad context related to what are the, in production, the apparent time NCS patterns that we're seeing in this community. So indeed, we see this very strong reversal in apparent time in these salient features, trap and lot. We see parallel reversals occurring among both Black and white speakers. And we think that the reversal appears to reflect these sort of ideological movements away from certain social meanings or personae that are associated with the northern city shift. Okay, so that gives us some context for what we're seeing. We are seeing reversal here. It's driven by these kind of interesting social dynamics. Again, I have lots more to say about that if you're curious. But now diving into this connection between production and perception. So in order to look at this sub question, how do speaker age patterns in production correspond to listener age patterns in perception? We are focusing on a particular subset of participants from this area that completed 2 tasks. So here, instead of looking at spontaneous speech, we wanted to control the kind of context of production a little bit more. So we're comparing in production word list acoustic analyses to perception in terms of, or measured by a vowel categorization task. So again, we're using the exact same participants who completed both and looking at how age structures the patterns, not only in production, but also in perception of these northern cities shift implicated vowels. Okay. So to give you a little bit more info about this subsample that did both the production and the perception task, this was 51 Chicagoans who were from this area. And again, they had already completed a sociolinguistic interview before doing the word list and the phoneme categorization task. All grew up in and or at the time of interview lived in Beverly or Morgan Park. And there was a spread of ages, so we tried to get as much of a spread as possible to try to test this kind of age difference from 20 to 79. And then just want to note that we had a mix of racialized backgrounds, but speakers identified primarily as either white Caucasian or Black or African American. And this reflects, the neighborhood's demographics, not in terms of the balance though. So this was just the sort of convenient example that we were able to get of folks who were completing both the production and the perception task. So there's a very strong imbalance here. 51 of the participants identified as white or Caucasian, 5 as Black or African American. As I noted, the reversal is happening amongst both groups. We don't have reason to believe that it's different between them based on the production data. So I'm not going to kind of go into this further or assume that there are differences between them. We also didn't test this because of the imbalance in terms of production, or excuse me, in terms of the participant makeup here. Okay, so moving on to just based on the word list acoustic analysis, what do our speaker age patterns look like? So this is giving us within this sample, are we seeing, the same trends toward reversal that we see in the broader community? Does this show up in read speech as well as the interview speech, et cetera? So more specifically, we're looking at this word list data. We had all of the tokens of interest for these 5 vowel classes that we care about in the Northern Cities shift: trap, lot, thought, strut, and dress. We normalized the vowels, and we're looking at midpoint measurements just as a kind of rough estimate, using regressions to see how speaker year of birth or age corresponds to their productions of these vowels. Okay, so just to show you what we found, here, just for the visualization, I split speakers into 2 different age groups, but this was all statistically analyzed as a linear age effect. So the older group is going to be shown in the circles and the younger group in the triangles. Okay, and again, I have the Northern Cities shift, what we'd expect, in the upper right-hand corner. So there were quite a few significant age differences. First, we have trap in the pink. It was significantly lowering and backing in apparent time, just like we found in our interview data. We also found that lot was backing and raising in apparent time, again, just like in the community-wide interview data. And these are both, again, reversals of what we'd expect in the Northern Cities shift. We also had some other findings. So we found that in the word list productions, thought was lowering and fronting, which is actually, again, if you compare it to the Northern Cities shift, an advancement of the Northern Cities shift. So here you can see that lot and thought are actually moving toward one another. We found that dress was lowering over time. Again, in some kind of models of the Northern Cities shift, this is advancing the Northern Cities shift. And no significant change in strut in either dimension. So to sum up from these word list productions, we see these significant reversals of the Northern Cities shift in trap and lot, but not so in the other vowels. So we're seeing advancement of the Northern Cities shift in thought, this movement of dress, and then nothing with strut. Okay. So that's what we found in this subset. And now we're going to try to see how that corresponds to the same apparent time or listener age patterns in linguistic perception using a vowel categorization task. So the categorization task is essentially the task I had you all kind of do at the beginning of the talk. So this has been used over and over again in lots of different realms of looking at speech perception, looking at sociolinguistic perception, but basically we're assessing where listeners are perceiving a boundary between 2 phonemes. So in this paradigm, they're hearing a series of tokens on a continuum, doing, in this case, a 2 alternative forced choice task. And this elicits for us where the listeners expect the sort of perceptual boundary to be between the 2. So like I mentioned, this paradigm has been used to look at these sort of top-down social expectations on linguistic perception. It's also been used in the studies that I mentioned earlier to look at these listener differences. So we have a nice precedent of using this type of a paradigm in this type of work. Okay. So I was interested in how listener age affects the boundaries between all 5 of the vowels implicated in the NCS. So these are the vowels, these are the boundaries that we're interested in the dotted lines. And the question is essentially, are the individuals who are more Northern Cities shifted in production also those individuals who are more Northern Cities shifted in perception? And are the more reversed people in production more reversed in perception? Okay. So like I mentioned, we need continua to be able to see where those boundaries are, where on the continuum you might draw a boundary. So for each of these phoneme pairs, we created 2 different 8-step continua in 2 different kind of word pair frames. All of them had the B vowel T frame and as well as another frame. And they were all produced initially by a white male speaker from the northern region of the US. So he was not particularly Northern Cities shifted. read minimal pairs, and then we used acoustic to synthesize continua, 8-step continua between them. So I'm just going to play you an example of the bat-bot continuum.
Bat, 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 bat.
Okay. So in this experiment, participants were provided with their 2 alternatives and asked to choose which word they heard, just like you did earlier. So for example, they would see the screen, they'd hear a word,
Caught.
and then they'd pick which one they thought they heard. That would advance them to the next trial. All participants responded to every step on all of the continua twice. It was pseudo-randomized. There were no adjacent matching continua. This was done in 2 different blocks following Draeger 2012. And no a priori information was given about the speaker. But I do want to note, this will come into play later, that I conducted a follow-up survey to ask the same participants what their social impressions of the voice were. And what's important to note here is that when asked about who the speaker was or what they thought about the speaker, basically everyone who responded heard the speaker as being around the same age. So they heard the speaker as being in his 20s or 30s, regardless of, you know, the participant's own age or social background. Okay. So to analyze data, models were fit for each of the vowel pairs to test how choosing one or the other phoneme was predicted by the listener's age, which, just like in production, was assessed, you know, as a linear predictor. We also looked at how an individual's own production of the relevant phonemes predicted their perceptual categorization. So we're looking not only at how listener age might shift the boundary that they draw between 2 phonemes, but also how their own productions might shift it, and whether we see correspondence in either of those domains. Okay. So coming back to these boundaries that we're looking at here, and I realize this is going to be a lot of information because we're looking at so many boundaries. We have the production data, we have the perception data. I'm going to walk you through everything, but I promise that I will sum it all up at the end. So if you need to like zone out for a second, that's okay. But I want to get into the nitty gritty and I'll tell you kind of what the broader summary is. So just keep that in mind. Okay. So we're interested in these 5 boundaries. And we have some predictions based on the wordless production data already, right? So if we map this onto the apparent time age effects for speaker that we saw in the wordless productions, for example, starting with the dress and trap continuum, if we expect that the age differences in production are reflected in perception, since dress and trap are both lowering and trap is backing, we would expect that in perception, younger speakers will expect a lower and backer boundary between the 2 than older speakers will, right? Since they're producing a lower and backer boundary. For trap and lot, since both are backing in apparent time, the boundary between the 2 is also backing. So on the continuum from trap to lot, we'd expect that younger listeners will accept these backer productions of trap or draw a backer boundary than older speakers. Given that lot and thought are moving toward one another, there's not a clear kind of prediction that we'd make. If anything, the boundary might stay kind of in the same place because they're moving toward one another. And then the dress strut and strut thought boundaries are a little bit harder to make predictions about based on what we're seeing. So we might expect that the strut thought boundary will move backer, but I'll note that it's kind of, or it's a little bit tricky because the stimuli and the continua were designed prior to getting the production data. So they don't neatly sort of reflect what's happening in apparent time. So I interpret those results with a little bit more caution, but I will show you what we found. Okay, and then we wouldn't expect any differences for this dress strut boundary just because strut isn't moving. But again, it's a little bit trickier to interpret those for this data. Okay, so like I mentioned, I'm going to walk you through each of these continua and what I found. I'm keeping the northern cities shift, or what we'd expect for the NCS, in the upper right corner. And remember, for each of the phoneme continua, there were 2 different word frames. I'm just showing you the collapsed version that's collapsing across the 2 different word frames. Okay, so to start with, the dress, trap, or continuum from left to right. I'm going to show you that continuum here. The percentage of trap responses is shown on the y-axis. And to orient you, the older speakers are always going to be shown with a solid line. The younger speakers are always going to be shown with a dotted line. And the thing that's the most important to know is that I've always arranged it in all of these graphs so that higher on the y-axis means that a listener expected a more northern cities shifted boundary, right? So higher just means more northern cities shifted in perception. Okay, so starting with this continuum, let's see. There was a significant age effect on how likely the listener was to respond to trap or show this expectation that the speaker is more northern cities shifted. But here, unlike in production, we actually see that the younger speakers, so this dashed line, expected a more northern cities shifted boundary than older speakers did. And this was a very significant result. For this continuum from to we also found a significant correlation between participants' own productions of trap and dress and where the participants' productions of, where they categorize the two. And this was in the expected direction. So here I'm showing you trap F1 on the x-axis, it's reversed. So as you move right, this is a higher or more northern cities shifted production of trap. And we see that as you get more northern cities shifted in production, you also get more northern cities shifted in categorization, right? This happens once we've already controlled for the kind of listener age effect. It happens across both of the age groups, as you can see here, a little bit more in the younger age group, but it didn't interact significantly with the age effect. Okay. Now moving on to the continuum. Again, you can see in the upper right-hand corner, in the northern cities shift, lot is fronting. So if listeners expect the speaker to be more northern cities shifted, they'll respond more likely on this continuum. They'll be more likely to respond lot. So again, just all you need to know is higher means more northern cities shifted in perception. And again, we saw that younger speakers were showing significantly more lot responses than older speakers, indicating they expected a more northern cities shifted boundary than older speakers did, even though this was the opposite of what we saw in production. Okay. Moving on to the continuum from strut to thought. Since strut is backing in the northern cities shift, we might expect listeners to show more strut responses. Again, always higher on the y-axis for the more northern cities shifted perceptions. Here, unlike in the last two continua, the older speakers in the solid line expected a more northern cities shifted boundary than the younger speakers. So the solid line's above the dash line here. Okay. And like I mentioned, I trust this result slightly less because of the way that the stimuli were constructed, but it's worth noting here. That's the finding. Next, the continuum from dress to strut. There were no differences in terms of categorization by age. And then finally, the continuum from thought to lot. Again, listener age was not significant here. It also seems to sort of indicate that we didn't actually capture the entire continuum. The categorization starts at about 50% as opposed to 100%. So maybe if we had the entire continuum, we'd see more of an effect, but nothing here in terms of listener age. Okay, so like I mentioned, that's a lot. So I want to just sum up all of those results in terms of listener perceptions in the vowel categorization task. So looking at our 5 vowels of interest, we did indeed see these listener age effects such that, a listener's age predicted categorization for these 3 boundaries shown in purple. So the boundary between dress and trap, the boundary between trap and lot, and the boundary between strut and thought. And they moved in apparent time in the direction that I'm showing you with the arrows here. There were no significant listener age effects between dress and strut and between lot and thought. Okay, so summing up how this relates to our expectations based on the northern cities shift, Younger listeners in the perception task showed more northern cities shifted boundaries, or an expectation that the speaker would use more of a northern cities shift than older listeners did for the dress trap continuum and the trap lock continuum. For one of the continua, there was an age effect in the opposite direction. So younger listeners expected the speaker to show a less northern cities shifted boundary for the strut thought continuum. And there were no significant listener age effects on these two boundaries, dress strut and lock thought. Okay, so putting that together with the production results from the word list, remember these were the changes we saw in the word list productions in apparent time. So again, we see a reversal of trap and lot, right? Advancement of thought and lowering of dress. So the arrow is showing us how the list or the speaker age effect occurred across apparent time. We can see, interestingly, that the boundaries that would be affected by these changes in production are still the same boundaries that are affected in perception, right? So since dress and trap are lowering, we expected a boundary change in terms of dress and trap. Same with trap and lot. Lot and thought, because they're moving toward one another, we didn't expect a boundary change and there wasn't one. And then strut and thought, because thought is moving, maybe we would expect a movement in terms of strut and thought, and we see that. But interestingly, the directionality of the apparent time change by listener age was the opposite of what we'd expect if perception just went right along with production. So the boundary between dress and trap in production might be lowering, but the expectation of a northern city shifted boundary was greater for the younger listeners than for the older listeners, which was pretty unexpected. So summing up what that means for us, again, we see the listener age effects in categorization in the same continua as those that we see age differences in production. So this tells us just generally that in terms of socially stratified changes in progress, we might expect there to be social differences among listeners, such that listeners show some sort of knowledge of the shift in this community. But more importantly, it's not the case that the age patterns in production are just kind of neatly reflected in the same direction as the age patterns in perception. So in production, younger speakers are reversing the northern city shift for trap and lot, but they expect more northern cities shifted perceptual boundaries for these phonemes than older speakers did. And on the flip side, we saw that younger speakers were producing more advanced thought vowels in the northern city shift, but they actually expected less advanced boundaries between strut and thought than the older speakers did. So this age effect was reversed in sort of all of these cases as what we'd expect in production. So just broadly, in all of these cases, not only do listener age differences and perception not just mimic production, they go against what we'd expect. And I think we need a little bit more information to understand exactly why this sort of crossover or overshoot pattern would happen in perception, but we have a few potential explanations that we think might hold water for us. So first, I want to note it's not entirely surprising that we'd find a production perception mismatch. Like I mentioned before, this has been found before, particularly in relation to sound changes. And some have actually proposed that this production perception misalignment is expected in an ongoing sound change. So Pinget and others found that as a change in progress is sort of nearing completion, they actually see that speakers will use the progressive form in production, but more conservative forms accepted in perception. So that explains why we'd have this sort of misalignment. But that doesn't quite get at why there'd be this overshoot, right? Why would younger speakers expect even more of the conservative northern cities shifted form than older speakers do in perception? So that's what I just mentioned. One potential explanation for this overshoot, we think, is that different listener age groups perceive the speaker's age differently. So maybe it's the case that if you're younger, you just think that the speaker is older in his 40s or 50s. If you're older, you think that the speaker is younger in his 20s. And therefore you see this overshoot because you're just aging the speaker differently. But at least in this study for these participants, that wasn't the case. So in follow-up evaluations of the voice, again, listeners of all ages heard him as about the same age, so in his 20s or 30s. So instead, I think that what might be going on here is that it's about the perceived age relation between a listener's own age position, their own positionality in the sound change in the community, as related to the perceived speaker's position. So here, older speakers, if they hear a speaker they think of as younger than them, they expect the speaker to be more advanced in the community-wide change, while younger listeners who hear a speaker who is older than them expects a speaker who's more conservative with respect to the community-wide pattern. And the fact that we see this sort of overshoot or mismatch might be related to a sort of overgeneralization on one or both of these groups' part related to how this age relation plays out in terms of the Northern Cities shift. So it could be that listeners have these ideologies about what it means linguistically to be an older speaker and be really advanced maybe with the Chicago accent, and vice versa, right? So that could be driving why we see among younger speakers, they hear someone they think is older than them and they say that person's going to be super Northern Cities shifted. Whereas maybe older speakers hear someone they perceive as younger than them and they say that person's going to be super reverse. So we see this overshoot based on their kind of knowledge and assumptions they would make about someone, a new speaker, and where they would fall in this kind of sound change in progress. It could also be the case that there's differential exposure throughout the lifespan that's contributed to their representations, to the exemplars they've been exposed to, and therefore to where they would draw these category boundaries. So this is something that's kind of unique to sound change in progress that was advancing over time and is now reversing over time. So the oldest speakers in our sample grew up at a time where the Northern Cities shift was still advancing, which meant that the older generations were actually using less Northern Cities shifted vowels than they were. And they were thus likely exposed to a lot of speech from adults that was less shifted than they were. And then combined with this recent reversal, they've also been more recently exposed to less Northern Cities shifted exemplars among younger community members. So older speakers might have these kind of examples of less Northern Cities shifted vowels combined from both kind of older generations than them and younger generations from them. Whereas for younger speakers, they grew up in a time when speakers older than them were all more Northern Cities shifted than they were. They're still relatively young. It could be the case that across their entire lifespan, they just have more Northern Cities shifted examples in their representations than older speakers do. So in general, again, I think there's more to be done to disambiguate what exactly is going on here, but we can say that this sound change reversal does appear to have apparent time effects in perception, not just in production, but these aren't sort of straightforward in terms of the directionality and the relation between the two. So going back to these broad questions, what is the relationship between production and perception of a reversing regional vowel shift at a local community level? We see overall that this is sort of a first step of looking at production and perception of this reversing sound change. And we see not only these sort of local age-based apparent time patterns in production that are really, interestingly socially stratified, we also see significant listener age differences in perceptual categorization. But notably, these listener social characteristics don't just sort of neatly reflect production in the perception patterns. So it's not the case that speakers just generalize the phoneme categories that they themselves produce to a new speaker. Like we know from the prior work that I mentioned, listeners can actively use their sociolinguistic knowledge, whether it comes from experience or from ideologies and stereotypes and assumptions, to adjust their perceptual expectations about a speaker. And that can shift depending on who they're talking to. So to capture how social differences condition differences in linguistic perception and in production, I'm arguing here that we need to consider not just the speaker, not just the listener, but the relation between the two, all contextualized in sort of local socio-historical context to understand better why we would be seeing the patterns in production and perception that we are. All right, I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you so much. Here's some acknowledgements to folks who've helped along the way. And I'm excited to hear your thoughts and take your questions.
Thank you so very much. Such an amazing talk, inspiring research. I really enjoyed this talk. I actually learned a lot, and this work is really relatable to some of the work that we do here. I really can't wait to see a lot of the stuff that you talked about in published work, specifically the work that includes both white and Black speakers for all the obvious reasons that we talked about. Thank you so very much. I'm going to invite virtual attendees to ask questions if they have any questions. So you can either use the raise hand function, or if you are more comfortable putting your questions in the chat, you can type your questions. Yeah, a lot of applause in the chat, so you can take a minute to absorb all that.
I don't know if I can see raised hands or not, so I think I see Sophia had a question. Is that right?
I see Charlie and Pam both have raised their hands. I don't know if I can go ahead and promote attendees to panelists, or
So I think Emma will do that. And
okay.
I think she's just promoted Charlie.
Okay.
Okay, if I'm first, thanks for the great talk, Annette. This was really cool. I had a question, or like maybe a possible idea of another factor for the end age difference.
Awesome.
I'm here reporting from Humboldt Park, so
Oh,
I have a
hi.
family in Chicago, and
Just around the corner.
I think a lot of the one thing I'm wondering about for the younger participants, and I don't know Beverly that well, but I wonder if there's also some factor of maybe they're perceiving the speaker as like Midwesterner, not from Chicago. Like if someone's not from Chicago, then maybe even if they're my age, they might still Northern vowel shift more.
Yeah.
And so I'm shifting my stuff. And I know like my cousins from the city are big on like, oh yeah, everyone in the colleges and that they come to the city from all around the Midwest. But so yeah, I was wondering about that.
Totally. Yeah. And the city suburbs distinction comes up a lot for Chicagoans. They love to say like, that's a suburb thing. And then the people in the suburbs are like, that's a city, you know, it's always not them. This is such a good question. I actually didn't mention this, but I asked in the same survey where I asked the perceived age of the speaker, I asked them, do you think they're from Chicago? Like, where do you think they're from? Got a little bit of a range of answers, but almost everyone said something like the Midwest. A lot of people said they thought they were from Chicago, which I think was just because of the, you know, the branding of the project. It made it very clear it was like Chicago project. But that's not to say that they didn't have more. So the big regret I had was that this survey actually wasn't done right after I did the experiment. I realized like pretty quickly, I'm like, oh, I want that data. So I always had to send it as a follow-up. And so I think I missed what people might have actually been doing. I re-exposed them to the same stimuli that they were hearing, but maybe didn't capture exactly what they were thinking in that moment when they were, you know, responding. And I think there totally could be something to that. I wish that I had more information, frankly, more specific information about where they thought the person was from. Even if they think that he was from Chicago, was he from Beverly? What type of person was he, right? Because I think that would really shape how they expected the person to sound. And if that were structured by age at all, that could be a potential you know, factor in why we see that overshoot. I think the clear next step for me is to try to do something that's, you know, using the social differences we think might matter, like this, Chicago Midwest or like city suburb as a top-down manipulation. Same with age. So like telling some people he's 50 versus 20 if they buy it. So I think that would be a really great way, but I share your intuition that there's more going on than just this kind of age dimension. It's just, that's what we had the info for. But yeah, it's really fun to hear people's ideologies about like who does not have the accent and who does. And yeah, it's really fun, but yeah, totally.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, I also wonder if you could possibly do like an interactive math activity kind of stuff with city, suburban areas. I see Pam's hand, so I guess I will unmute and then Pam can ask her question.
Yeah, well, to some extent, oh, sorry, can you see or hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, I'm not sure.
Oh, now I can see you.
Okay, there we go.
Hi,
Hi, Annette.
Hi.
Good to see you. Thank you. This was, I'll echo what all the applause was and what Charlie said. This was fascinating. You've had my brain is still kind of exploding from the data because
there's a lot.
I've really been thinking a lot about the relationship between perception and production, not just generally, but in terms of sound change. So, in the back of my mind are all of Jonathan Harrington's work and stuff like that, where this is just not at all what you would expect.
Right.
And so first I was thinking, well, maybe reversals behave differently, but then I don't know why reversals would behave differently. So I'm rambling here kind of because my brain is still sort of like trying to process this, but in some ways you sort of addressed my question in what you were saying to Charlie's, but I mean, you were saying one thing you might try to do is try to fake people out and say this is an older speaker, but another possibility would actually be to do a voice that sounded older. That's a lot more work, obviously. Have you thought about doing that?
I think that would be like the perfect complement to the kind of giving the top-down information, especially because you can only go so far in terms of what people will believe for age ranges. Right. So I think that would be super interesting, and even just manipulating social characters. So someone has brought up like if these stereotypical Chicago personae are gendered, as male, what would happen if you used speakers from other gendered groups? So I think there's lots of interesting stuff to be done with multiple voices. And I'd love to do that. I haven't done it yet, but I think that would be really fascinating to see what folks do with that. There could also be something to the other aspects. I mean, they're only hearing single words in this particular experiment, but if they had a little bit more context for the voice, if they heard other features that they would make assumptions about based on, say, class or things like that, I think there'd be really interesting things to come out. So yeah, I'd love to do that going forward. And to your point, I did not expect, I reran so many times to make sure I didn't make an error in my coding because I didn't understand how it could be the opposite directionally. It just didn't make sense. I do think it could be something related to the reversal point though.
I was going to ask you if you wanted to elaborate on that, if you thought it could be that.
Yeah. So kind of what I was saying, and I'm not sure how I feel about this, to be honest, but I've talked with some folks about the idea, right, that if it was advancing, right, when say the most advanced, people were kids, the baby boomers generation, were kind of the peak of the Northern City shift in this community, their parents, their grandparents were less shifted. And now their kids are less shifted. So they've just had more exposure to the less Northern cities shifted features over the course of their lives, let's say. But it doesn't really, I don't know if I buy that because if they're talking more to people their age, it's trickier.
Yeah. And the younger people would have no idea that they're doing a reversal.
Exactly. Well, yeah, that's a question because there are some younger people that will say, that sounds like Chicago, classic Chicago. That sounds like Bridgeport. That sounds like a White Sox fan. And I'm not that type of Chicagoan is kind of the idea. So I don't know. They don't know that they're reversing, but they know that they're moving away from something that, used to be really Chicago-y.
That I get, but.
Right.
But presumably, even if you think of like Harrington's or something, the younger speakers might well have be aware that they're doing more fronting than the older speakers are. So.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of baffling, but I do want to do those kind of manipulations, like you mentioned, with different voices or different top-down information to see if it's about that, perceived age or whatever it might be, or if something else is maybe going on.
Okay, thank you. I don't want to monopolize the questions.
Thank you.
Thanks. I see Sophie's hand raised, so I guess you can unmute yourself, Sophie, and also turn your video on yourself.
Oh, there we go. Okay, yes. Yeah, I'll just echo what everyone's been saying. This is such a fascinating talk. I also, it's super interesting to me. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, but my mom's from, my mom and her family are from Beverly. So
Nice.
Yeah.
Awesome.
It's interesting to see this and think about how I listen, how I hear their vowels and also their own kind of relationship with Beverly. So I think
there's also,
yeah.
I mean, there are, sorry to cut you off, but there are dimensions that I wasn't able to mention within Beverly. So a big finding in production that I couldn't get into is that there was a big Catholic public distinction. So people that went to Catholic high schools were much more northern city shifted than people who went to public or non-Catholic private schools. And I wouldn't have even drawn that distinction if I didn't get to Beverly and immediately people were like, the Catholics and the publics. I'm like, what? Is this real? Yeah, turns out for vowels it is. So, but anyway.
Oh no, I think I'm frozen.
I can still hear you.
Oh, okay, you can still hear me? Okay,
Yeah.
well, that's, my screen is frozen, but that should be fine. If you can still hear me, then that's fine. But yeah, actually that was kind of a side question I had, was whether you looked into is not just what primary school they went to, but also secondary schools, because I know there was also this, that's what I would almost see mobility in the city as moving, also moving out of these neighborhoods to a certain extent. So maybe they're not mobile in terms of wanting to leave Chicago, but they're mobile in terms of wanting to leave the neighborhood.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. So that was kind of a side question then. And I thought that would be an interesting thing to add into, surveys and sociolinguistic aspects. But I was wondering if, I guess I thought it was really interesting, the aspect of the thought vowel was still being produced, was following the NCS, whereas the other vowels were not. And I was wondering if you had some thoughts about that. Well, thoughts about that. And then I guess in terms of your production versus perception of that, if they were to produce it but not perceive it, and you could look at that result, because I think that it was difficult. I can't fully remember from your data analysis, but it was more difficult to look at that because it was in opposite directions. So do you have any plans to kind of look more into that, or?
Yeah, this is such a good question. I mean, full disclosure, I have those vowels merged, so it's very difficult for me to talk about them unless I'm using Wells classes, and that's why I do it. So lot and thought. So one thing to note is that this was a place where the word list, at least for this subset, the word list diverged from the interview data. So we actually didn't see thought moving for the interview data, and it was very strongly moving for the word list data. So that's part of why I'm I just want to be really conservative with how I approach some of trap and lot. I feel really good about. They're definitely reversing everywhere. It's clear. Thought is a little bit weirder. And I think what might be happening is slow movement toward merger over time, rather than just kind of these moving as individual pieces. So we have some speakers, not everyone, but some younger speakers whose lot and thought classes are basically right on top of each other. In particular, the Black speakers in Beverly seem to have a kind of merged, at least in production, merged vowel space for lot and thought. So I think there could be something there going on, which, you know, kind of goes with what reversal is doing in general, to the extent that it is mimicking like what's happening in the West, what's happening in other places. I just think we need a little bit more. I mean, I just want more data from everywhere, and that's part of why we're expanding the project to other neighborhoods, because I think Beverly has a lot kind of going on, but that was an inconsistency. And I know even in these other cities in the Inland North where we're seeing reversal, thought is always, it's not totally clear what's happening with thought. So I'm curious to see the next site. So Charisse is working on Bronzeville, which is a historically sort of middle-class Black neighborhood that's now gentrifying. And our team is going to the far northwest side, Jefferson Park area, which has some kind of shared demographics with the Beverly Morgan Park area, with the biggest exception being that I think the Black population there is less than 1% or something like that. So there are shared qualities among the white speakers there, but the racialized demographics and the relations are very different. So I'm super curious to see what's happening with thought there. And I also want a better designed set of stimuli. So I think I mentioned this, but we, you know, started the project going into these neighborhoods. I wanted to simultaneously do our production analysis and this perceptual task. But the downside of that is the stimuli weren't designed to reflect this particular community's kind of, you know, entire range. So I think in a better kind of controlled set of stimuli, we might be able to capture that a little bit better. But if I had to guess, I would think that there's a merger afoot. I don't know. We'll see. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
No, thank you. Yeah, that answers it, absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Thank you so much. I don't see any other raised hands. I honestly have a ton of questions, but we're at time, so maybe I can ask a few questions in the reception in a more informal setting. So I'm going to ask if does anyone have any other questions? So I'm going to put the information for reception in the chat. So here's the link. That's the passcode. So maybe you could take a 10-minute break and then come back. And I guess we're going to stay for the reception until 6 p.m. our time and 5 p.m. your time, Annette, right?
Perfect.
All right. So if no one has any final questions, oops, sorry, I think, oh, thank you, Loretta. So that's the information for the reception. And let's take a very short break and then meet back. Thank you so very much, Annette. This was amazing, inspiring talk. And I honestly learned a lot, and I can apply a lot of this to my own work. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for your really nice comments and questions. I'm excited to keep chatting. It's great talking to you.
Thank you. We'll see you in a bit.
Okay, bye.